All right, welcome to the discussion on functional analysis, functional assessment, functional behavioral analysis, functional behavioral assessment, functional behavior A's, FBA's, FA's, FBA's, whatever you want to call these things. There's a million names for them. There are some differences in there that we're going to talk about a little bit, but specifically the difference between functional FBA, functional behavioral assessment, and functional behavior analysis. So a couple of different things that we have to go over here. This is going to be rather quick because most of this is covered just directly in your textbook, so we'll just zip through the material, and if you have any questions, feel free to post a question or drop me an email. All right, in general, the idea with a functional assessment, and I tend to boil this stuff down into FA, all right, functional assessment, and I know your book bunks it into functional analysis, but the core of this is all the same thing. The argument is, or the differences lie in where how detailed you get. So for me, the practical aspect of things is FA. It's just we're just going to, I'm sorry, the practical aspect of an FA leads me to using that as kind of my base. In the experimental literature, of course, I would go with a different route here, or if we were trying to explore a new phenomenon, I would probably go with a completely different route. But for the sake of argument here, we'll just stick with functional assessment. So ultimately, the goal is to identify the likely function of behavior. We have two behaviors that we're going to focus on here: the likely function of problem behavior and the likely function of desired behavior. Now, there is a key here, and that is the word likely. Don't take it lightly, because we will not know for sure what the maintaining contingencies are for the behavior. We might get a darn good idea, but we're not going to be 100% confident. In other words, we are not telling you, with an FA, we're not going to come up with a guaranteed function of the behavior. We'll come up with probabilities and say that this is most likely what is maintaining the behavior. This is most likely what is cueing the behavior, prompting the behavior. But we won't be able to say it with hardcore fact about cause and effect. That's because FBAs, so functional behavioral assessments, do not establish cause and effect. That's not their goal. Their goal is to, again, figure out what the functions of behavior are, or at least get close to it, enough so we can build treatments around that. Okay, a functional behavioral analysis does establish cause and effect. So with an FBA, an FB analysis, I should say, that will identify the function of behavior. Not likely, not maybe, not probably. It will identify the function of a behavior. Why? Because with an FBA, not only do you do your observations, but you build an experiment into it. So for the purposes of this course, though, we're not going to be focusing on building an experiment into our analysis here, or into our assessment. So to kind of give you an idea, an FB, that gets so funny to talk about because they're all the same letters, and a functional behavior assessment will get you close to what is maintaining and influencing behavior in terms of SDs and MOs and reinforcers and all those things, right? Once you have that, then you can do an experiment to see if you're right. When you've completed that experiment and you've actually found out if you're right or not, that is a functional behavioral analysis. Okay, so that at that point we can actually analyze what's going on. So that's really your difference between the two, but the core of it is figure out what's going on with behavior and use that to build a behavioral plan to change this person's behavior to select for new responses. So again, we're going to be looking for the problem behaviors. What is the problem behavior? What's the definition of it? How often is it occurring? Under what context is it occurring? And specifically, what's maintaining it? What is the reinforcer for this behavior? Because that's ultimately what our question should always be: is what is reinforcing this behavior? Because if we can find out what's reinforcing it, then we can knock off the reinforcers, at least possibly, right? Or maybe we can try to use a different behavior that will then, what do you say? That will reach the same reinforcer, that will serve the same function, right? So, but that's what we've been talking about throughout the quarter. All right, so how do we do it? Right off the bat, the idea is for us to gather evidence, lots of it. All right, we're going to get evidence from every aspect of things. We're going to talk about interviews, we're going to talk about direct observations, we're going to talk about all this stuff. But ultimately, the idea is to gather some evidence. Right? Then, once we get that evidence, we're going to either attempt to change antecedents, so motivating operations, or standard deviations. Have I been thinking about statistics today? I don't know. Discriminative stimuli, all right? So motivating options are, geez, there we go. This is all just getting buggered, right? Motivating operations or discriminative stimuli. And with those discriminative stimuli, of course, we're going to be thinking about adding or removing them to cue the proper response. Of course, that assumes that you've got stimulus control going on already, and that you can use that stimulus control to your advantage. All right. I'm laughing still because statistics are so far from behavior analysis that how I slipped into that mode, I have no idea. Just those darn SDs, right? So the darn SD is actually an SD for an SD. And if you can figure out what I just said, then I'll give you an extra point. All right. Anyway, so we can either modify antecedents by adding them, removing them specifically with discriminative stimuli, or we can change the value of reinforcers. So we can devalue a reinforcer, which is a common sort of procedure. We devalue it. That way it doesn't maintain the old problem behavior that we had. Or we can shoot at changing consequences. So again, the idea here is we got the evidence first, and then we found out based on that evidence what we can do. We can either modify antecedents or we can change consequences. We can put somebody on extinction. We can start reinforcing appropriate behavior. We could use DRLs, DRAs, DRHs, DR whatevers, right? So we could use DR zeros. We could put them on a fixed ratio schedule or a variable ratio schedule, a fixed interval schedule or a variable interval schedule. Heck, we could even do a fixed time, fixed duration. We can do all those different things, right? So when we say that yes, you can change the consequences by modifying the reinforcers. Yes, that's a very blanket statement to basically say read the other 400 pages in the book to figure out what we mean by changing reinforcers. Right? It's not that simple, but you do have a lot of options available to you. Right? Or we can put punishment in place, and the same thing goes with punishment. There's a bunch of different types of punishment procedures that we want to use. What's the intensity for what behavior? How often? So on and so forth. Right? And ultimately, what we really want to do with FBAs is, so we've got the evidence, we've put a couple of procedures into place to reduce the problem behavior, and now we want to provide alternative responses. And ideally, those alternative responses should lead to the same reinforcers that the problem behavior was leading to. That way, it makes it a little bit easier to select for the new response. Say, you know what, that old one's not going to work anymore because I'm going to punish the snot out of it, but the new one, you know what, that'll still get you the same social reinforcer, tangible reinforcer, food reinforcer, whatever it is, right, that was maintaining the particular behavior. But we're always going after those alternative responses. So let's go back up this chain a little bit and go, how do we get the evidence? Here we go. The FA interview. There are two types of these. There's a direct interview and there's an indirect interview. Of course, the direct interview would be talking to the individual themselves, and we could even do some initial observation in there. Not much, some initial observation, but ultimately what's most common though is an indirect approach for the interviews. Right? We're going to use all sorts of things like behavioral interviews, and in terms of we're going to interview people about the behavior of these kiddos, if you will. So we're going to interview their teachers, we might interview their peers, we might interview siblings, we might interview parents, we might interview the principal, we might interview whoever else has contact with this kid, right? The issue, though, comes in the fact that most people make judgments about behavior, and they do it inaccurately. So we do have to take these things with a bit of a grain of salt, but they should inform you at least a little bit about what conditions these behaviors happen. So we tend to like to use the W-type questions. When you switch to a math lesson, what does little Johnny do? Right? So then you've got this scenario set up that, all right, when this behavior happens, what have you, or when this context, this thing in the environment changes, you switch to a math lesson. So that's the thing that's changing. When that happens, what does little Johnny do? Right? So what behavior is he going to output? And we're hoping that you've made some decent observations and that you can give us some actual feedback on this, when we do these types of questions. But not everybody can. But those types of scenarios tend to be helpful rather than tell me about the problem behavior. Right? That's not neat. That's not going to get you much information. So we have to get context specific. We have to get detailed. We have to probe to see what may be reinforcing, may not be reinforcing these behaviors. Right? We can use rating scales. Right? So is this behavior intense in this scenario or not, and not as intense in this scenario? Do they like this sort of reinforcer or access to reinforcers, or do they like that sort of reinforcer? Whatever it may be. Right? We can use checklists. Do they do the behavior in this context, but not in this one? Do they do it here, not here? Do they do it there? Do they do it there? Well, yeah, great. So little Johnny will always speak out of turn when he's doing math and science, but when it comes to reading and writing, man, the kid's on task the whole time, right? So the behavior, being able to stay on task, is obviously behavior that the kid has. It's in his repertoire, but he's off task under certain conditions, right? So checklists, right? These are the initial step in doing FBAs, and we tend to use these to inform us for the next steps. This is not the end-all be-all of an FA, and if you find yourself just doing these questions, you are not doing an FBA. You're not doing a functional behavioral assessment. Indirect stuff is just that. It's indirect. We much prefer direct observation of things. And you can ask the client, the kid with the problem here too, but that's only going to get you so much information. You need to actually get in there and start observing behavior, because we really are awful at interpreting why and when we do things in general. So you need to get that outside perspective. So just asking somebody what's going on it's functionally irrelevant, to some degree. There are some informative things that you can glean from it, but not a ton. So just be warned with those interviews that there's a lot of questions. I've provided some questions with you that you may use. You may have gotten some others from your job site or other classes that you've taken. You may have looked in your book and seen some questions in there. No one set is the right set, but you should start to develop a theme as you start to see these types of surveys and questionnaires that you may be giving people. I shouldn't say surveys, the types of questions that you're giving people. And you should see what types of things they're asking about, and you can even develop your own. But the idea is ultimately two things: when does this behavior happen? Under what conditions, and so when and where, and how much is the behavior occurring, and what is reinforcing it. So I think that was three things. I said two, but whatever. You get the idea. All right. So the direct descriptive FBA. We're going to use ABC recording here. ABC stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. You know this more accurately as discriminative stimuli, behavior, reinforcers, punishers, extinction, so on and so forth. So it is the three-term contingency. So the idea with the ABC recording is to get yourself to actually record that three-term contingency, and the ABCs just make it easy to remember. So we're going to start out with information from the interviews about when maybe we should be doing these observations, what types of things might we be looking for. Of course, we have to find the behavior properly ahead of time. So once we get this kind of guiding document here, then we're going to go ahead and move forward and start to record all the antecedents. Right? And we're going to record everything. A lot of people think, oh, I just wait for the problem behavior to happen, and I'll just write down what happened before it and write down the consequence, and I'm done. No. That is a easy way out of doing an ABC, and it will not get you success. What you want is to record all antecedents that kid is experiencing that you think are important. Man's, tacts, when we're thinking about verbal behavior. Let's see, what else? Changing lessons or transitions or going to recess or different task requirements that you're asking the kiddo to do. Are you asking them to read? Are there other people present? Or is or her friends present? Are they sitting next to something? Basically, you're recording absolutely everything, and then you're going to record all instances of behavior, not just the problem behavior. Under this new scenario, when you see a different thing, a sort of new scenario developing, what was the behavior? So you're going to record all this stuff, and of course, the big focus is going to be on the problem behavior, but also you want it to be on the desirable behavior, because if you can get both, if you can get information about both, you're going to double up your efforts on the FBA. All right, and it'll be able to be more successful. So, and then record all possible reinforcers. Again, you don't know what these are, but you know that you're not sure exactly what the reinforcer is, or if it even is a reinforcer, but at least you're giving it a shot, right? So you're writing it down, and you'll start to see themes that maybe food is a reinforcer for some of these kids, maybe it's not for others. Right? So record all possible reinforcers, and of course you're going to do this independent of the problem behavior as well. So we're trying to capture any reinforcer that would work, that may enable us to do to reinforce other behaviors in general, the desirable behavior that we want. Right? Narrative ABC. Okay. This is where we only focus on the problem behavior itself. Again, I don't like this one so much, but it is much more, it's much easier to pull off. You're just waiting for the problem behavior to happen, and then you're doing your observation. It gets kind of boring, believe it or not, because the problem behaviors often don't occur at the rates, at least in the everyday typical classroom, they don't occur at the rates that that somebody represented that probably brought you into the room. More often than not, somebody is really annoyed with a problem behavior, but that annoyance is built over time, so they're not really accurate on how much it has occurred, and they're very accurate on the fact it does occur and what consequences it produces in the classroom, but it may not be happening as much as what they think it is. So again, narrative, we're just going to do all the things that we talked about above, recording the antecedents, recording the instances of behavior, and recording all possible reinforcers. But we're only going to focus on that when the problem behavior occurs. A little bit easier to do, a little bit more manageable, not as intense in terms of the amount of writing that you need to do. So, but you get a lot less information out of it, and it makes it adds to guesswork later on when you go to build the behavioral intervention. You're kind of guessing at what reinforcers might be and things like that, just because you didn't get a good observation of all the instances of reinforcement that may be happening in a particular setting or with a particular person. So once we've decided which one we're going to do, what are we going to do? We're going to collect the data, right? How do we collect the data? Well, we've talked a lot about that. Are you going to do interval recording, partial interval recording, whole interval recording? Are you going to do duration recording? Or no, that's what it was. So are you going to record the durations of behavior? You're going to record instances of behavior. What's the frequency? What's the rates? Are you going to break it up into 2-minute intervals or 10-minute intervals? How are you actually going to get all this data? How are you going to observe? Are you going to get somebody else to observe with you so you can establish an observer agreement? You should, if you have the ability to, but oftentimes we can't. Are you going to be using video cameras so you can later go back and slow this down and code it, those types of things? Or are you going to be sitting there in the classroom making your notes? How are you going to make those notes? Are you going to use a notebook? Are you going to use an iPad? Are you going to use an iPhone? Because all those things, for about $20-30, you can get an okay-ish app for the iPad and the iPhone that covers some of these things. You could build your own on a computer. There's no reason why you couldn't. And anyway, so you've got a lot of options about how you collect this data, and that's where you go back to your textbook and go, well, this is a discrete behavior, so I need to be using frequency counts, and and maybe even calculate a rate out of this. Those types of questions or steps that you may need to take are things that you have to address on your own. There's no one rule about how to do it. Right? So once you've collected your data, you're going to analyze the data. You're going to develop a couple of hypotheses. What do you think is going to happen? Right? So how can I fix this behavior? Right? Then we're going to ideally test those hypotheses. Now, as I'm stating here, we're only going to do that if we're going to do the functional analysis. So develop the hypothesis would be something we're going to do always, but the testing that hypothesis is the realm of an FA, our functional analysis, and that's where we really get in to find out exactly what the reinforcers are. And if we're going to do that, we're going to do reversal type things, reversal tests, which we've talked about before, the AB designs. We could do maybe some other designs as well, but typically an AB design is what we're after with a functional analysis, because we need to demonstrate clearly that that behavior is under the control of that reinforcer. Let's see what else. So again, we can skip this test hypothesis when we go collect data, develop hypotheses, and develop interventions. When you develop the hypothesis, you're saying that this is what I think is maintaining the behavior, or the inappropriate behavior. So your intervention better be based on that hypothesis, that if you observe this in your observations, so now you're going to say, all right, this is what I think is going on, so let's build an intervention that matches what you think is going on. Don't just go in and start willy-nilly choosing things like extinction when it's a behavior that's naturally reinforcing. That's just craziness, right? Because you're not paying attention to what you've got. So if you go, hey, this behavior seems to be automatically reinforcing, then your conclusion should fit along those lines. So you need to prevent the behavior from occurring because it's automatically reinforcing. So you need to do something else. You need to focus on another behavior, or prevent that behavior from occurring, or work on the cusp behaviors or something like that, something else, or put it on a DRL, if you can, if you've got control of the reinforcer. So focus on functional equivalence. When you have, this is what I was talking about earlier. What is that behavior getting you, right? So if you've got an inappropriate behavior and it's getting you attention in the classroom, replace that inappropriate behavior with an appropriate one. Establish functional equivalence. Give the kid a new skill that will access the old stuff. A new and appropriate skill that will access that old stuff. Right? Stuff meaning reinforcers. Right? Evaluate, did it work? And FA is not done when you develop the intervention. You have to go back and watch the behavior. This thing is empirical. You're doing, in a nutshell, you're doing an applied experiment. And if you run this thing, you try your procedures and it doesn't work, well, guess what? You need to modify your program. Because if you're not sensitive to those types of things, you're just being unethical. Right? If you don't evaluate, you don't modify it based on your results. Of course, that's assuming you needed to modify it. Then you're not doing a service to the person. Right? You've got these tools in your tool bag. Use every one you got available, and try to work through each one you can that's relevant. If it's not working, try something different. Don't throw good money after bad. Don't sit there and beat your head over a wall doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. It's not producing results. That's just crazy. Right? Change your procedures. Be critical, and don't worry about failing, because guess what? You're probably going to choose a technique that doesn't work. It's okay. That's fine. Behavior is sensitive to contingencies, so you will have learned something, and that's where that art of doing this behavior plans and actually behavior modification stuff, that's where the art comes in, is that you're going to try certain things that you believe in your heart are going to work. This is I love DRLs, it's my absolute favorite thing, but you know what, sometimes they don't work. So you learn under what conditions they do work. So guess what? While you're learning to do all that, while you're out there managing other people's behavior, your behavior is being managed by your success of managing other people's behavior. So what works for you will get whatever tool you used will likely be reinforced if it worked. And you'll be likely to use it again. Some things aren't going to work, and you'll learn when to apply the extinction, when to apply the reinforcers, when to go, you know what, I know that I could probably use a DRL here, but I think I'm just going to go for a DR0. I think that I can get away with it in this instance, and you'll learn when that is. But the only way you're going to learn that is through practice and actually getting out there and trying these techniques. And it's not quick. Well, relatively speaking, it is. A week or two of doing this, that's pretty quick. Fixing a behavior that's been a problem for years. But it takes. We seem to want these things to change extremely fast, like minutes fast. And it doesn't. You have to be patient with it, and you have to watch, and you have to observe the behavior directly. And again, a lot of people make the mistake of assuming they can figure out if their behavior has changed just by kind of doing a half-assed observation, if you will, meaning they're not actually recording the data. And if you find yourself in that scenario thinking that, I'll be able to tell, the teacher will stop complaining or whatever, then you're not doing the right thing. You need to actually get in there and count and see, did this behavior change, did it not? Did it increase in frequency, did it decrease? Because that's where you're going to evaluate whether, that's how you evaluate whether or not you're effective, not just based on some assumption that you think, I think it worked because I like DRLs, right? The ultimate goal with FBAs is to get away from this contrived reinforcement situation. And yes, you may need to use a contrived reinforcer, or whatever that may be, to select the appropriate behavior. But you need to get ultimately that behavior to be automatically reinforced, or the natural environment will maintain that behavior. If you can achieve that, you've been unbelievably successful. And how long does it take to do that? Well, a couple of weeks, you get the behavior under control, now you start fading and transferring the effectiveness of one reinforcer to another. So we're going to fade out that old reinforcer, fade it into a new one, maybe thin it out so much that there's no contrived reinforcement around there at all, and that may take a month or so. Excuse me. So otherwise, in other words, you got a lot of work to do. This is not just something that gets thrown in there and something you do in an afternoon, and hey, guess what? Solve the behavior. No, you got a week or two worth of work here, and that might even be just the observations. When we talk about baselines, we talked about that before. You can flip to the front of your book and take a look. Baselines cover, 5, 10, 14 data points, which could be over each one could be over a day, maybe a couple weeks of school, just to get a baseline to figure out where the behavior is now, to figure out if it really is a problem or not, and what you need to do. Because again, that baseline will tell you, should I use a DRL? Should I use a DRH? Should I use a DR0? Should I put on extinction? That information comes from the baseline. So you can really, by doing detailed, careful observations, in other words, doing that quality ABC analysis, then you can really start to get a change in behavior in a very effective way using these procedures. But again, the key Make sure you evaluate. Make sure you go back and modify. Every time you make a change, go back and evaluate it again. Continual revision is the key with this stuff. Again, ultimately, if you've got a contractor force, you're always trying to figure it out. Something natural. Okay, that's about it for FBA. I'll talk to you again about something else.